my recording is now. Awesome. All right, let's roll. So this is sort of a precursor to what we'll be talking about at the end of the day in the main session, but I wanted to address root zone set points separately from the bigger discussion about auto set points and just overall best practices regarding profile zones. So this is going to look at root zones, why you would use them, some scenarios, and then going back to the profile sum and saying, here's some more advanced ways to know you've got it right. So I hadn't really thought about root zone sums in this way until I was preparing for this presentation. But if you break it down, there's really two reasons why you would use root zone set points. And so like I said, we'll be talking about we'll be talking about the offset feature. So that was that feature that he showed the new UI on the what's new. That was a late launch before install season last year. Definitely added some confusion. I want to clarify how that works, especially now with the new UI. And then, like I said, we'll go into some more advanced techniques on how to know you're correct in the profile sum. So, as I broke the root zone sum reasoning down, I thought of two reasons. One, which is simpler, is you have a crop that will have a maximum root depth. Now, whether that's some crop specific limitation, or maybe it's a limitation in the field. But either way, you have a crop that will hit a certain point and go no deeper. So that's one reason, right? So that would be more of like a season, look at certain depth at using a root zone. The other reason, which I think is more challenging and can be used depending on your situation, is actually a root zone sum that's going to adjust as the plant is developing. Those are two very different use cases. The first one is a little bit simpler. Think like lettuce and potatoes and strawberries, like shallow rooted crops, or maybe a field with compaction. And the second one, you're actually trying to adjust that profile sum as the plant is developing. So going back to that first situation, if you've got a field that you know there's compaction, you might be able to tell that based on historical sensor data. You've seen it, you've seen limited infiltration from previous sensor data, or maybe you've actually done some of the testing with some of the methods that Nick talked about in his presentation yesterday during the ag training. But either way, we're going to have some sort of limitation on how deep that root's going to go. Now, flipping back to adjusting as the crop develops. Personal preference, but for me, I find that challenging because most of the crops I'm dealing with develop so fast. During that rapid vegetative growth stage, your target's moving so fast that I guess I find it simpler to set my main target on my profile sum and leave it. And maybe you're adjusting that strategically rather than trying to adjust that root zone as you go. And that's a lot of work too, because today it'd be a manual process. There's a lot of data science questions and thoughts about how we can roadmap things like this into the app. But today, evaluating that as a second potential reason you may want to use a root zone sum. And in that scenario, you may use it for a certain period of the season and then actually go to a profile sum at the end, because maybe your root canopy has reached its maximum depth, or it's already below the bottom sensor. And that's another good point too, is so if you've got a really shallow sensor, there's probably less need for you to use a root zone. If you have a really deep sensor, then there would be potential for more reason to use that. So depending on what hardware setup you've got, how deep you've installed it, so for example, if you're offsetting a V4 all the way and you've got a 41222 configuration, probably not much use in using a root zone set point on a point.
Hey, Nick, how does the status bar know which to go off of? Or did it root zone or profile? If you choose to do one or the other?
Great question. So the question was, the soil moisture status bar on the field will be the profile sum, or if you turn the root zone sum on, it's going to default to the root zone sum. So the status bar in the app will be based on the root zone sum if there is one. I thought this was a cool shot of, I think this is some sort of fancy university, like X-raying or radar or something, some kind of imaging, but this is on YouTube. This is showing root development over a time scale, and that's the number of days. So you're still at 20 days, and then all of a sudden you get to about 25, 30, and it's not linear, like it explodes. The amount of root mass occurring between like day 20 and day 40. And so I think it's kind of a cool picture as to why it could be challenging to be using that second method to do root zone set points and have that targeted. Okay, so shifting gears to talking about the offset logic. So we'll get into this later, but this is basically currently how an auto set point would adjust, how it would be set initially and how it may adjust after following wetting events. So keeping that in mind, now we're going to talk about that offset feature, which does everybody know what I'm talking about when it comes to, this was a feature we launched in May of last year, and the purpose of that feature was to give you a tool to influence that initial set point. And the challenge was that we had a couple years in a row of dry springs and dry soils going into installs. And if you allowed the app to select that full point without any sort of input, and especially in a dry climate where you're already using water and you may not be counting on large rain events to set those and actually find that field capacity, we needed some sort of user input to help adjust that field capacity closer to actual. And so that's why we implemented that feature. Taha talked a little bit about the intricacies and some of the tendencies that we learned by analyzing the data from last year. So keeping all that in mind.
Sure. So to be able to do that, you have to be on that status, right? You have to be able to adjust, say not the offset, the root zone.
So anybody but viewers can adjust set points. Okay. Yeah. So that's adjusting existing set points. This offset feature is something that you would do at the time of install. And now I'm realizing that I have like one iteration before screenshot of what the screen he just showed. But basically you get the idea. We are going to push the user to say, let crop X decide. And if you want to take the reins and override it, that's okay. And it's going to be by depth. So you'll have a 1, 2, and 3 foot depth choice to say, is that depth at full, optimal, or refill? And he mentioned these tooltips in the previous session, but click on those. I think it'll help, especially, that person that's going to be installing your probe may not be sitting in this room right now. They may be sitting in a classroom somewhere and they're going to be putting your probe in. So going through that with them, that button is right there. Hopefully it helps explain what the purpose of this feature is and what the implications are by what you choose. Getting everybody on the same vocabulary. So here's how it works. This logic can be applied at every depth, right? So you have your 3 choices, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. You're going to choose full, optimal, or refill. And then it's going to apply that field capacity logic to each individual sensor. And this is how we'll offset those initial points, right? So this is our default here, right? So we have our moisture, here it is. We're just going to assume that that's field capacity. That's the default. You tell me that it is not full in that field capacity, but it's actually somewhere a little bit less, then the current moisture is going to be the midpoint between the full point and the refill point. If you tell me that that individual depth is dry and you selected refill, it will set the initial measured moisture as the refill point. Field capacity would be above as such. So that's how that logic works. Again, at each individual depth, and then it will get added up to be displayed on your profile cell. So again, just another example. What did you select in that install? Refill. What did we select in that example? Optimal. So these are just like a day or two of data at this point, right? That's what it's going to look like 24, 48 hours into your season. What they selected, install, or let CropX decide. Yeah. That was that image I selected to throw in yesterday. It was something I've never really seen before, and I think it's cool because it's a good picture showing the rate of growth and its relationship between level of moisture in the soil. And so you want this to be maximized, right? And so that point between where this begins to dip and where this is still maximized, like our refill point is somewhere right here, right? Like that's our ideal refill point. So think about that now moving into our next section about some advanced ways to identify that we know we're in the right place.
That when you set that as a finish, does that override the automatic update if it tries to change? Does that override that?
Good question. So you selected optimal. Well, let me go back one. Right. So think of this on an individual sensor level, right? So you selected optimal, right? This middle one. If I get a wetting event that only goes to here, did I establish a new field capacity? Not yet. If I got an event that got to here and then leveled out, did I establish a new field capacity? Yes. So at each individual sensor, that's being evaluated and then added up to show what's on the profile sample.
I got the opposite problem. If it is, I would maybe, I don't know if I'd ever said it as an optimal. I probably almost always said it as refill because we're too dry and we'll never see field capacity on my field. Does that override that, or eventually will that shift down? And thinking that our original initial install was actual fuel capacity and dropping.
If you select refill and you never establish a higher refill or a higher fuel capacity than what it already has, then it's not gonna change.
It'll go up.
Right, it should, yeah.
Good question, why aren't we allowing like, somebody doing this, and we feel we're gonna be for years, full, same location, and we just go back to the initial set points they had?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is like, hey, let's look at last year's data to determine what our set points are for this year. I think that's a really good reference for you to use. I don't think it's perfect enough to just copy paste. You know, there's always gonna be a little bit of differences. I mean, you can drill 10 holes right next to each other and put the same exact sensor in 10 different holes, and you're probably gonna get plus or minus 5%.
Can we get that from what it was previous year, so?
Yeah, so if you wanted to access your historical data, you would just go to the field and then sensor data. And then that drop down there, like if you've ever had multiple sensors in the same field, that drop down that you have to select, so that's where you'd access your previous
I
years.
never put the same sensors, I mean, the panel numbers in field, but there's always kind of the same location. But so when I go in and I pick that, and they're all, they were saying about half inch all the time.
Right, exactly. Yep, yeah, they're close.
I was just gonna add, Nick, you need to do that on the desktop, right? You need to view sensor data there.
Historical sensor
Yeah.
data is only on web. Yep. Okay, so thinking about that rate of growth, and as that rate of growth decreases, we're getting drier, right? So what does that look like on our graph? Let's predict what the next slide is. What's that gonna look like? Like water use was good, and then it's not so good. So we start by saying, okay, where's our roots? Where's the activity? How much activity is there? And look at that throughout the profile. So like in this example, you've got, high activity at this top sensor, and then a little bit less activity as it draws down, right? So that use curve begins to flatten out. So you can evaluate that both on a profile scale and each individual sensor. Same pattern you want to look for. Again, looking at this, if you look at that usage curve, especially at those top sensors, that gives you kind of a good idea as to when it's starting to run out of steam, when that available water is starting to become harder and harder for that plant to extract from the soil. How are we doing on time? What was the end time?
$55.
Okay, fine. So now, taking that back to a profile sum look. In this example, you have more usage occurring after that recent wetting event, which makes sense. You've got water in the profile that's easy for the plant to grab. And as it gets drier, it becomes harder for that plant to extract that water. And so that use curve begins to slow. We've had a lot of discussions internally about how we can make some more advanced logic, some more advanced tools for you guys to help identify where those thresholds are, maybe or we could almost say like auto refill points. Not something, immediately in the cards for this year, but that's something we've been talking about and essentially looking at something very similar to this logic we're talking about right now. It's a good way for your eye to identify where that point is. That was faster than I thought. Do we want to talk about any of those other curves or maybe some of these individual sensor graphs? Or any other examples of folks that have had trouble identifying where you might set that refill point? I've had several examples where, you know, my full point's probably good, but I actually want to stretch that refill point lower for especially maybe higher clay content soils. I may be wanting to do that. The current logic on how that initial or the current logic on where that refill point is set is fairly basic. It's more or less just a certain percentage of that full point. So as I said, like that's one of the things we've really talked about, you know, advancing how we set that refill point.
I gotta, I guess, go back since you have some time, go back to the optimal full refill. So on all my installs, because as dry as we always are at that install, I have to fill the hole, I have to, there's no way to put it in otherwise. I've been told a couple different ways on what to select in that menu. I don't think, even though the hole's full of water, that ground soaks that away so fast, I don't think that that's a true field capacity point. But what should I be putting on that?
I think what you're observing at really, right? And
That's
maybe part of that's going to be, yeah. That does bring up another, it's a small change in the logic on how these are being set. Or I guess I should say not how, but when. So last year, you wouldn't have that initial set point until about 48 hours after. And the reason we chose to wait that long was because of what you just said. Is if you fill that hole with more water than what is otherwise environmentally available everywhere else, we really need to wait until that data kind of goes away to say, okay, now I can evaluate my field capacity. What we've done this year, because of kind of the opposite problem, is we've shrunk that down to 6 hours. The reason why is because you kind of get caught between a stone and a hard, or a rock and a hard place. If say this is 48 hours after install right here. Well, what if I had a wetting event between install and now? My input on the install form is sort of invalid now, right? But it wasn't smart enough to count for them. Because it's saying, okay, now it's 48 hours after, now let's evaluate where field capacity is. This was the user's input, okay, it should be here. So we rolled it back to 6 hours, so that will minimize the amount of wetting events occurring after install. And I think because we've sort of updated our best practices, going away from the V2 and the V3 and using a lot of water to just say necessary water, hopefully we'll avoid those use curves. And hopefully most of that's gone within 6 hours. So that's kind of the balance that we've taken on when those are going to be set. Dan, did you have one?
Yeah, I think I have one incident the last time where most of my fields, I have like 2 sensors like very closely about 10 foot apart. And one sensor was like reading to field capacity and the other was loading. So I remember I contacted Ben about it and we were looking at how to adjust it. But by that time, we haven't had any wind yet. those. So, I guess maybe my worry is, of course, I'm also not closer to the field most of the time. I rely on what the farmer tells me, like, whether the soil is more, like how they view moisture at that point to be able to make a decision. So maybe if this lets the properties decide kind of option that may help, especially installing brainstorming. It's not really a question, but I just want to point out.
Yeah. Yeah, we sort of want to push the user to just roll with the default. I think what we learned last year was that, kind of like Taha indicated, like we have a tendency to just think things are average. And so a lot of people just selected optimal. And the other thing that was a little bit of a wrench is there was like a small period during the install time when it accidentally got set as a required button. And that wasn't supposed to be the case. So it was forcing people that otherwise probably didn't know what the heck this was doing to select something. So a couple of those things, lessons learned. It was one of those features, we did a training on, but, emailing and webinars and text messages only go so far. It really takes a year of experience to wrap your head around something like this.
I was thinking the refill points are typically we're utilizing 70%. Is there something that would direct us to different crops that might be able to set that better?
Yeah, I mean, maybe John can speak more to that as to like some of the considerations the agronomy team have thought about how to customize that auto refill point, but
Yeah, in terms of smart algorithms for the auto refill point, we've thought about, so right now it's takes into account the field capacity and texture class. We've thought about also providing a little bit of change per crop and also per growth stage. So for example, in corn, I think most people that are managing corn here know that your most water sensitive time of the year is up into those early reproductive phases. So maybe a smart system would eventually tighten up the allowable depletion at that time. All kind of at the conceptual stage right now, but those would be some considerations you might take into account for your own business.
Yeah.
Is it a good practice to put the field capacity and wilting point at the beginning if it's in a dry? I mean, if I don't know that information when I'm on the field, known field, is it maybe a good practice to put those initial points at the beginning and then after a wetting event, activate the automate that point?
So the auto will be on by default. So if you wanted to set something manually, so like, I just want to make sure and differentiate between the offset, which is an installer input, versus going total manual. Like, I just want to set my points where I want. Okay, you can do that immediately after install if you'd like, or whenever. Esteban's question was like, should we set something manual and then turn it on to auto later? You can do that. In fact, can you set the auto set points to like turn on at a certain amount of time? No, I didn't think so. Right, I was saying like if you shut them off, then if you want them to turn back on, I think it's just gonna turn them on right then and there. That's right. Yeah.
Ours last year kept kicking back on.
For July, kind of get it on, go back to auto, I had to shut it off. A week ago, I was like, what's going on here? Every couple days, I have to change it back.
I don't know of any known issues with that. I mean, probably had manual on 30-40% by end of season, and mainly that was like just pulling that refill down further.
I saw this come in as a bug report. It certainly wasn't on purpose. I don't know what happened, but that's not, it wasn't intentional.
It wasn't all up, but there was the same one repeatedly every time, every couple days, came a couple back.
When they take over, they don't not.
Cool. We're close. Anything else? Anybody else? Anybody has?
But I tend to get after the session this morning there, I tend to see or feel that you guys are more comfortable with leaving the autos on. Correct. We're making progress that way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do we have statistics on like global manual versus auto?
In terms of the customer behaviors,
Yeah,
they're 80 to 90% on automated. And I think our best data set of how they're doing is from the US team and from you guys. Like you monitor enough units and you feel like they're better than human, not all the time, but the majority of the time.
yeah.
Or you may as well adjust it.
What's that?
Where you made it, where you adjust it, where you adjust each foot.
By depth. Yeah.
and change it.
Well, and I think the other thing that was going on too is like maybe you did accurately identify that initial moisture, but maybe you were only identifying it for that top foot. Like maybe that's what their input was meant for. But what happened was you're applying this offset on every single sensor, even if it was 3 foot deep. So then you'd have sort of this like inflated bias on those bottom sensors. We saw that.
If we ever have, or maybe you do, always use manual. If we ever have an auto update, let's say I've got a 36-inch probe, I know I'll never use it. I set it at 24 inches. That's automatically in manual. Would you ever have a auto adjust after you set a route on? Am I making sense?
Yeah, so the question is auto set points for root zones. Yeah, it's been very popular. We talked about that a little bit on Monday in our internal discussions. It's definitely something on the science team's radar. So it'd be a matter of the challenge with that is like I think what you said is like the easy phase one, where it's like you tell me the depth and we'll just evaluate auto set points. Like you can essentially use all this same logic to do that as long as you provide that depth input. It becomes a lot more complicated if you're like, well, just tell me how deep it should be. Then you're going into like, okay, well, you can probably build an algorithm that says like, okay, this is how deep the roots are in the profile, watching that individual sensor graph, but you've got a lot of sort of gaps with some of those sensors that don't have a sensor every 4 inches. That's one challenge. And the other challenge would be like, I guess I would say it like, how far ahead of those roots do you stay, you know? So as far as your depth and your root zone calculation. So that becomes probably a lot more challenging if you're doing that method. I think that like tell me the depth and then run auto set points off of it would probably be easier, but I'm also not on the data science team. Cool. Yeah.
So we came off an extremely wet spring. Yeah, basically quarter did rub down. And I'm fairly new to the control well and came on like August. So, but and that goes by around corner on Morgan with involved with this one. That turned out the ground. What farmer called my cedar after the stop. They go out there, figure out what near needed stop. Rebecca comes out, figures out that basically, you can see the graph, like we did, like through it after my onboarding, where you can see the graph, basically, the moisture was only being taken in that top little bit, the rest never moved. So what suggestions or recommendations? And that's part of the reason I came on board was to help people get that rate.
Yeah, so in that scenario, could be a field limitation. If you've got compaction, or maybe it was too wet and you ended up at R1 with 10-inch roots because it was wet for the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season. I think either one of those scenarios are good examples of when to use that root zone sum in this first manner. Like, there's a maximum depth I'm going to get to or manage for the season. Whatever that depth is, now let's manage the root zone there. Good question.
In the, with regard to the accuracy, say, you know, you may have done some research using photo Setpoints that you have also measured like lab, done some lab analysis like gravity water content and other things that supports like data that we get.
I don't know of any like hard and fast white paper stuff. Like originally, this was built off of all of the data from the crop metrics acquisition, is my understanding, and all of those manual set points that all of you built for years. And it's kind of a simple phenomenon that we're trying to identify. It's like at some point, my soil can no longer hold additional water. Like that by definition is field capacity. And so that pattern is pretty identifiable. And so we've taught that algorithm to identify that pattern. So that's what it's looking for. It's looking for that that spike and then level peak. And it's the point at which root activity begins again, the point at which the soil is holding that water.